innovating practices.
All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this open interview. I'm really excited on behalf of the Silicon Valley Design Thinking Club. My name is Mickey Usman, and before we get started, I just wanted to kind of introduce what we're going to be doing today. So this open style interview is going to kind of start with some questions that we have already laid out, and then after those, we'll open it up to everyone and go through the questions you all have. So as we are talking through this, what you can do on Zoom is use the chat feature to post any questions that come to mind. And then near the end, or like the second half of this, that's when we'll kind of read out those questions and have our really special guests answer them. So with further ado, welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
And Matthew, let me introduce you a little bit more about Matthew. So we're super excited to have Matthew, who is a business transformation leader. And he's a founder of a group called the Menark Group, and they're a strategy program delivery training organization. And they kind of specialize in providing operational innovation capacity to various companies of different sizes. And Matthew has over 20 years of experience leading international finance, commercial functions, and transformation programs. And today, Matthew is here with us to kind of address these different questions that we have in this uncertain time. And a new book called Fit for Disruption. And in this case, disruption is very evident all around the globe. And this disruption is really affecting the things are kind of playing out for businesses. So I wanted to open this up with, for Matthew by asking, how did this kind of play out with the timing of the book? Because it seems kind of suspect, and I'm sure there's so much experience and effort that went into it that it was probably coincidental.
Yeah, let me give you some background. I deliberately, wanting to write this. I wanted to write this book for quite some time, and I set aside the second half of last year to do that, which is exactly what I did. I actually was over in the States, over in California, came home and went, right, that's it. I'm writing this based on my experience. And I had at the time, what I really wanted to do was help organisations understand that the exponential rate of disruption coming is so great, and it was almost like people weren't facing into it, or if they were facing into it, didn't necessarily have the tools. So I wanted to go ahead and write the book, which I did. And it actually wasn't called Fit for Disruption to start with. It was actually, the working title was Profit by Design, and that will come through a lot in the book. I come from a finance background or accounting background, so the commercial aspects are very, very important to me. But I wrote it, and it was done and dusted, and I can tell you the exact date. On the 4th of January, my publisher had went to market and spoken with many people from the target audience and asked them what the title should be based upon the information he gave about the book. And they gave a few options, and overwhelmingly it was Fit for Disruption. And I remember at the time, my wife and I going, is it? And we go, oh no, actually it is. And it worked out beautifully. And then when the time came, so that was on the 4th of January, and then it was going to print, putting the final touches to it, the cover design and all that sort of thing. And then it hit, and it was like, oh no, like it looks as though, I was opportunistic. And I actually personally struggled with that because I didn't want to, because I literally want to help people. But to cut a long story short, I had some advice from a very close friend and neighbour, and he said, you must do it, because if it helps, one person or saves one job or helps one business stay in business, then it's absolutely worth it. So put it out. So yeah, it's a
Awesome.
long way of explaining what happened, but that was the journey.
Yeah, I feel like just going through the book, I think it's a perfect fit, and not in the sense of kind of exploiting, but rather providing assistance during this time. It kind of
And I think that's the point too, Mickey, is the principles apply, pre-COVID, they apply now, and they apply, it's just they're accentuated now. That's all.
exactly. Yeah, so like going to the, pre-COVID right now in the current situation, how are you seeing that strategic advantage of companies that are fit for disruption, that have followed some of the guidelines and the frameworks that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, just I'll use an example to answer that, which links into the into what we were just talking about, how we came to publish it. But in the first chapter, in talking about strategy, I refer to Qantas, which is the Australian national airline.
Mm-hmm.
And I was basically putting them up in lights about their fit for disruption, their commercial, and when I'm publishing it, they're not even operating, right? So it was like, how does that happen? And then the main competitor to Qantas in the Australian market is Virgin, and Virgin has gone into receivership. So they're in a world of pain. But again, I think it came back to I think Qantas. What I rested on was, like, I was almost embarrassed that I put Qantas in there, but now it actually illustrates the point perfectly, because that's a cutthroat industry, right? And it's very, very across the globe. And about, I think it was 2011, Qantas faced into their issues and really focused on being commercial. And one of the biggest issues they had was they had this massive industrial relations issue, and they couldn't break it. And if they didn't break the problem, it would have sent the organisation broke. So in 2011, they grounded their fleet. So we're talking nearly 10 years ago, they've started facing into their problems. And they've grounded their fleet, and then, and people have opinions about whether that was right or wrong, but it was quite a drastic measure to take. But they were very, very serious about being commercial. But since then, what they've been doing is, and this is true to many airlines around the world, because they have to, and because it's such because it's such a cutthroat space, they've had to innovate as well. So if you look at online check-ins and how they handle baggage and how they handle in-flight entertainment and so forth, it's actually quite advanced. And then again, you look at Qantas, they've got they're doing cutting edge stuff like Perth to London, 17-hour flights, New York to Sydney, again 17 hours or 17 hours plus.
Mm-hmm.
So that was breaking edge. But I use that because if they weren't commercial, and if they didn't have a mindset of innovation and creation and pushing boundaries, they wouldn't have survived this. They just wouldn't have. It would be over. So I think what I'm saying, but on the flip side of it, I know organisations that possibly could have really taken advantage of this time, and they're probably well positioned.
Yeah.
But they've actually collapsed under the pressure. And I know, like, some logistics companies, for example, if they had been had a bit of foresight and, entered into, for instance, robotics in the warehousing, they would have been able to handle some of the e-commerce issues, for instance, that are going through now. That opportunity is gone.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like during this time we're seeing some companies really, really survive, while others are kind of just trying to, like maybe even almost closing doors. But this
Yeah.
idea of kind of being a business in motion that you put forward in your book, that business should never be still, and the concept of pivoting. Like, my question to you is, how and when should businesses know that it's time to start redefining their own strategy?
It's a very, very good question, and I know that it's not good enough for me to sort of say every single day you should be reviewing that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first thing is, and I'm almost borrowing Simon Sinek, you have to understand your why, and why you exist and who you're serving, and all of that sort of thing. And you've got to be true to, you have to be true to that. So you can't change your strategy every day, because the world does move all the time. And so if you keep changing your strategy, everyone's going to get lost and confused. So you can't do that. But as long as why you exist stays to the center, you can pivot around that. It's sort of almost, it doesn't matter how you serve your customers. It just you can just change. But to answer the question directly, I think it's really important that organisations don't jump at shiny lights or become, like at the moment, in a panic situation, so that they have that centre, but equally have enough awareness and have a culture embedded so that when that time comes, that they can. And you can't change everything. So you've got to change the things that matter most. And that is going to come from your customers. So if you're really in tune to what your customers how they're behaving and what their needs are and how those needs are changing, then you can respond at that time. But you can only really do that if you're close to the customer and let them tell you when it needs changing.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, it seems like being really close to the customer, empathetic of them. It's like one of the defining principles that we, see in design thinking as well. Kind of the idea of empathetic design, staying close to the customer, maybe not just while creating the solution, but throughout it.
Yeah, I'll give you again another couple of quick examples. My wife works for a major life insurance company, and they're quite progressive in the way that they think in terms of healthier, better lives for their members or customers. Mm-hmm. They were going down, and they're doing a lot of stuff in digital and so forth, right? But obviously, say when this environment hit, they knew that they had to accelerate that, so then they had the structures in place to do it, but they let the customers tell them to pivot. Now, before they, for instance, something as simple as executing documents, they said, the customer was saying, that's not of interest to us. We actually don't value that. But clearly now they do value it. And now it's a game changer for them. But they let the customer tell them that now was the time to pivot that particular part of the strategy.
All right. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's the customer that tells you when it's time.
Yeah. And you have to be in touch with that, clearly.
Right. Yeah, the culture of kind of being in touch with the customer, I imagine, plays a huge role in whether a company is willing to pivot or whether it is willing to be open to change. But we very often think, a lot of us have probably worked in a company like that too, which is really, really hesitant to change, whether it's a small change or a big change. And I always wonder, what do you think are the common barriers that are causing some companies, big or small, to be resistant to that kind of change?
Yeah, and it's frightening with all the literature and all the knowledge that we have. These organisations still fall into the same trap, and even worse, you've got massive corporations with all this resource that should be able to create, right? But it's someone in their like I'm exaggerating. It's someone in their garage that is doing it. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a couple of things. I think the first is trust. Trust is, and particularly, I've got in Australia, there's an executive coach who's world renowned. His name is Connor O'Malley, and he talks about trust, but particularly trust within yourself. And so you have to have trust that you can lead this and work through the change, and that you're open to change. You actually have to trust yourself. But it is a leadership question, no doubt, and leaders have to be open for change. And if they're not open for change, it's not going to happen. But but you then, and then if they're not open to change, or then if you have the wrong culture and you've got a toxic culture, then it's certainly not. And you need to be set up to be able to change as well. If you're, I mean, you look at some of the banks now, right? They're so stuck in their systems, their legacy systems, that structurally they're actually not set up to change either, and they need to fundamentally face into that. Or if I come down to a small business example, it was a really lovely story. It was a cocktail bar here in Australia, local in Melbourne, and what they did is COVID hit, they weren't allowed to operate, but they turned their space into a kitchen to create care packs and food packs for hospitality workers that were now not in work. But 99, and I'm generalising here, but 99% of people went, "Oh, we have to shut the doors, we're closed." Yeah, and they thought that was their lot, that was it. But if you take the example of this guy, he was open to change and whatever it took, and now he's done something amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw a similar example here in San Francisco in the Noe Valley area. There's this restaurant that I like to go to, and they've been evolving like throughout this process. At the start, they were doing their regular meals kind of pre-packaged, ready to go, and you just buy at the door. And then now they've taken all their inventory that they usually get and basically created a little store, like a grocery store inside, that has all their specialty items.
Yeah, exactly. And you see many examples of that. And so then it becomes a choice and a mindset, right? So the barrier is a mindset, quite frankly.
The barrier is the mindset. Awesome.
Yeah. And that's not to say, I mean, we also have to understand people are going through a lot, so it's important I don't make a statement like that without empathizing that people are actually suffering, right? I guess my point is that we are where we are, and it's about facing into it and trusting yourself, and then having the mindset to take this to change.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting balance between preparedness and mindset. Maybe a business might not necessarily have everything ready to go as they should, though, but at the same time, if they have the mindset, they might be able to, stay fit during times of disruption.
Yeah, I agree.
So when a company does start to take on this process of restructuring, pivoting, or becoming resilient during this time, what are some of the pitfalls that they should really look out for?
I'm not sure. I don't know whether I've got it here. There was, I absolutely loved it. Oh, here it is. Dr. Michael Ryan, who works in the World Health Organization, is one of the leading doctors, sort of leading this effort, I guess. And there's a great YouTube, where he talks, and I'll just use his words. And it'd be good to send out the YouTube on this, because it was actually quite compelling. But he said, perfection is the enemy of good when it comes to emergency management. Speed trumps perfection. And the problem in society we have at the moment is everyone is afraid of making a mistake. Everyone is afraid of the consequence of error. So, so I guess that the first part is, there's that fear of failure and being able to overcome that, and to just move and just you know, if you take that example, if they didn't move, people died, and in a business sense, if we don't move and if we don't act, then we're going to struggle. But it's you know, it's that thing about going fast and trial and error and all that sort of stuff. And I know that today's environment is slightly different, but the principles still apply. You still have to put yourself out there. You can't, if you sit back and wait for the perfect answer, you're going to be in trouble. But I think organisations should get very focused on what they're doing and have a really good understanding about where they're at in that journey. I think we touched on before, some people are in survival mode, and some people are actually able to leverage off the advantage of the times, because there are some companies that are. The word, then what I'd want to say is what we have to do is then accept that the world has changed and it will never go back to what it was. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just won't be like that. So when people think about how they're responding to this or how they're going to try and thrive in the next stage, what's really important is they don't use pre-COVID as the reference point. Yeah, they have to understand, or they have to be very alert and open. And this is why design thinking is a perfect tool to actually help organisations and people through this change. The other thing is I've seen many organisations do this, and I actually have a supply chain background as well. And then what they do is they then attack their suppliers, and they, you know, I've seen mass media statements, we're not paying rent, we're not, you know, honouring these commitments, and you know, without going into the ins and outs of how they actually got to that position. But it's a very short focus, I think, and for companies to do well and either survive or to do well through this, they need to do it together. And if you're alienating people, there will be a time when, I mean, COVID won't be long forgotten, but there will be a time when COVID won't be so pressing. Right. But then they've just destroyed their supply base and their relationships and their trust. And it makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. And if you know, what's the point?
Yeah, that seems like a big pitfall, actually. And I see some companies performing well in that, and some maybe not so much, even in this time. For example, one that comes to mind is Airbnb. For example, they let go of a lot of people recently, but they did so in a really good way, in the sense of they provided like outreach and helping recruit the people they were laying off to other places, and just their reputation in a way that, you know, like valuable talent will probably still want to join in the future.
Yeah. And can I give you a fun fact? Through this whole COVID period, my wife and I have been holed up in an Airbnb.
Oh, have you?
We're having some works done to our house, and because of an insurance issue. But we've literally been out since I think the 17th of February.
Probably one of the few people who are in Airbnbs right now.
I know, and I think that the lady that owns the place is so grateful. Like she's the most day. She's you know, she's counting her lucky stars.
Good.
But anyway, that's a fun fact.
So the next question I had for you was about customer journey. But before I get into that, I just wanted to remind our audience that you can post your questions in the chat, and pretty soon we'll start reading them out and addressing them. And if your username for some reason doesn't have your name in it, just like attach your name to it so I can read that as well. So the question about customer journey. So you talked about supply chain, but going towards the end of that, towards the customer journey, when we're trying to find that closeness and empathy with the users, especially in a time like this, when we're so detached from them sometimes, how do you find that closeness when you're distant from the user?
Again, I think it's a mindset thing, because I actually think Now, I know we don't have physical proximity, right? I understand that. But we're probably more intimate now than we ever have been. I mean, you're looking, albeit at Airbnb. If I move aside, you're in my home.
Right.
So you're seeing me in my most vulnerable point. You have kids running up, you know, parents trying to work, and there's children working. There's sorry, children working, parents are working. But you're actually seeing people in a you know in their own environments where they're experiencing real problems, and you're actually watching it unfold, because it becomes a little bit more real than what it does sitting in a, you know, an office or whatever it might be. So you can actually see the problems if you know. So, and a lot of people I find are making an effort to communicate with each other, and not just in this, but if we're now talking about a business environment, you know, you only have to go to social media channels to find out what people are thinking and what problems they're facing, and you can engage people on social media, and it's become very, very normal and somewhat very intimate, you know, for a lot of people. So you know, I look at it as, you know, we've actually, this has actually opened up a massive opportunity to further empathise with customers and to truly understand their needs.
Completely agree. I'm from an ed tech background, and as an instructional designer, I'm seeing that happen a lot as well, with just the closeness to the customer. Since there are more students online, more students have to be online. So I'm seeing the closeness and the data to back up, you know, decisions. Is there's just much more data now to really make informed decisions.
You're absolutely right, and I think because of the dramatic impact of this event has really changed everything. So I think what it's also doing is it's helping us understand the why a lot clearer, because people are actually really assessing what's actually important here. Why are we doing things? You know, why is that important to me? And that's coming out now. Everything has been challenged, and that's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So going towards kind of our audience in the Design Thinking Club, a lot of us are leaders in our own organizations. And one of the things that we often wonder about is how can we play a role in making our organization stronger, whether it's stronger to, you know, stimulus like COVID or other disruptions that might happen.
Yeah, look, the principles of fit for disruption apply to leaders, emerging leaders, as much as they do to organisations. But again, it certainly comes back to what has been a common theme in this conversation, which is around having the right mindset, and about being able to open your mind to what the possibilities are. I think a lot of organisations are under, and a lot of leaders are under pressure. And I think what we have to remember is leaders are also human as well, and they don't have all the answers. So, you know, I think it's a great time to support each other, and you know, as we know, leadership isn't a title and all that sort of thing. So we can support and lead people that are in a position of that they need, you know, that they need to push through. You can support them. So, you know, now's not the time for, I don't know, for being needy, and, you know, now's the time for support and really, you know, wrapping your arms around each other and going through it together, regardless of how that looks. You know, and making sure that it's, you know, there's environments there that people can actually ask for help. So at an individual level, be brave enough to ask for help if it's needed, or be open, or be ready and inviting for people to ask you for help.
I see. So it's both the kind of reaching out and seeing how you can help, as well as being open to help yourself.
Yeah, that's right. And there has to be a belief without proof that we're going to get through this thing, right? We're going to work our way through it. It may not be all roses and thing at the other end, but we're going to do it. We're incredibly resilient. I mean, we're designed to be resilient. We've done it since the start of time. So just have that belief and just go about, and do the right things right, I guess.
Nice. So looking at the questions in the chat, one of the questions that really seems appropriate here is the mindsets that we talked about, whether it's being open to change, whether it's being open to help or reaching out to help. How do you think one can best foster those mindsets in an organization? Do you think workshops help? Do you think like what type of trainings do you think are most effective in achieving that?
Look, there's probably two parts to that. I think the first is you have to have, there has to be a culture and a want for that to happen, and that's going to be motivated by the leadership and the people that are part of the organisation. So and then what you have to do is you have to make sure that you're not, what you see in a lot of organisations is they're so busy and so focused on today or tomorrow that they have left no capacity to deal with situations. So how do you possibly be creative if you're at 120% capacity? You can't do it. But then what you need is I guess a structure and a way to do it, and that's why design thinking is so powerful, and it's where you get a meeting of minds and a structure and a framework to be able to work through problems, define those problems, really empathise, understand your customer, prototype, everything that comes with it. It's a fabulous framework by which to instill that creativity, and I'm sure post this, a lot of organisations will take it a lot more seriously and embed this into their organisations, and because they need to be ready.
Do you think it has to come internally, or is it better if that kind of stimulus comes externally?
I think, it's actually a really good question. I'm a passionate believer in building internal capability. So the organisation should have that. So, for instance, Menark, my group, we go in there and we help organisations build the capability. We'll help deliver, but we're not interested in being the external party that comes and does it, because it needs to be ingrained in the psyche of the organisation. But depending on where the organisation is at, though, many will need external help. And the other thing that's interesting, even if you were very mature on your own journey, with this, you should always be seeking external advice and not looking internally. You should be looking to see what other organisations are doing. You should be, so you should always be keeping that open mind as well. But to answer your question directly, I think, the best outcome eventually is to have an internal, to have the internal capability.
Awesome. Deborah also responded to the question, and Deborah Nelson said that she feels like it's a critical aspect for success for companies to be building that closeness and that design thinking capability and mindsets. But she also asked, how can we get companies to really value investing in that?
I'll give two answers. I think COVID is going to force some organisations to do it, right? They're going to have no choice, and I think the way that society is working at the moment, I think we're actually seeing the benefits of and the power of empathising. Yeah, so I think that will come just by the event. but the second thing is, like I have children. My children are, you know, I started young, 24 down to 14. So I have 4 children. They're not going to put up with it. What say my era did or whatever. So there will be a consumer customer just expectation that this needs to happen, and they won't. You know, my children won't put up with a work environment that doesn't offer that, and they're certainly not going to work with purchase from organisations or spend their money on organisations that don't live by those values.
Right. Yeah, it seems like the generations as we go on, much more open to, you know, opposing that current or traditional way of maybe having that fixed mindset.
Yeah, and I liken it sometimes to like sport. I remember, you know, years ago, it was almost like, you know, you had to run 20 laps of the oval and do X amount of push-ups and sit-ups, and, you know, until you're sick. Whereas now it's much kinder and much more straight. Like, you know, but they're able to get better performance because they're empathising with the needs of the athlete.
Right. Yeah, like kind of customizing it to their
Yeah.
needs.
Yeah, and that's going to be the way of the future, right? Everyone's going to want their own needs met.
Yeah. Speaking of the future, Helen Wu's question is about the trends and like predictions for post-COVID and how COVID is kind of changing the travel industry, the hospitality industry, as well as kind of experience economy. Will they ever go back to incorporating physical brick and mortar locations, or will they shift to more digital interfaces?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and if I had all the answers, I'd be doing okay. Let me try and answer it this way. I think there's been such a dramatic shift in the way that we do things. Again, I'll reference my wife again, and where she works. They probably had a culture of, you know, they did a bit of work from home, but it wasn't embraced, and they didn't see the benefit of that. But now, some people that you would least expected are actually the biggest advocates for it. So that's, you know, that's going to fundamentally change the way that we work. So if you've got organisations that were probably not even close down that journey to now fully embracing it, that will change the way that will change the way we work, and that's going to change everything by how we get to work, what we eat at work, you know, cafes, after dinner drinks, all that sort of stuff. So that will fundamentally change. And then how do we deal with education and childcare and so forth? So that's one part. The second part is so the working from home thing and the way that we work will fundamentally shift.
Mm-hmm.
It has shifted, and it won't go back. It won't go. In fact, it will just accelerate. Mm. Then there's digital. If you look at retail, people are now, if they weren't before, they're now very, very savvy with purchasing online. So you have people that were maybe hesitant or slow in adopting digital to purchase products. They're all over it now, and again, I can't really see that going back. There'll always be a place for bricks and mortar retail, and then it'll probably be more around retailtainment than selling. But you know, that will be a massive shift, and then whole supply chains need to be re-engineered to support that. You know, to get it. You know, to get those products to the purchaser.
Yeah, it seems like there's definitely a restructuring happening, as well as people experiencing things that they might not have before. Like you said, online shopping, for example. Anyone who was hesitant to it, you know, like how else are they gonna buy clothing or things like that these days? They have to kind of experience it.
And there's other things like just the way that we function. Like when my wife and I, we walk our dog, you know, morning and night, and we walk around the park, and You know, now there's a lot of, you know, and I'm talking because, you know, in Australia, we've got, you know, we've been able to go out to the park, and admittingly how many people that you could go with. But what you're seeing is also a lot of families out there that weren't there before. So a lot of these families are going to be reconnecting at a deeper level. You know, before it was just get up, go to work, send the child to school, send, you know, whatever. Whereas now they're probably going to get very, look, and I'm assuming here, but I think people are probably going to appreciate some of the basics of life a lot more, and appreciate those things. You know, some of our department stores here are just sold out of everything. You know, forget people setting up home offices and all that sort of stuff, but just activities and board games and balls to go to the park, and I think people will reconnect with that, and that will continue.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like COVID has really shown us how technology can both bring us together, but also maybe make us feel like there's still something missing in the connection that we have in person. I think it's both, you know, brought us closer and brought us further at the same time. Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, look, I think when all the restrictions are lifted and so forth, I think it's going to be almost one hell of a party, right? I reckon people are going to be hugging, and I think people will be respecting the distance, but I think people are just longing for that connection, and it's now at their awareness that before that they didn't, you know, it happened and they appreciated it, but now it's something, you know, it's so special to people now because it's been taken away from them.
Yeah. Chris Colaboo asked the question about short-term focus versus long-term focus, basically asking, does having like a short-term focus help you be more apt at being ready to, you know, pivot, be disrupted? Or is it more like a long-term focus that would benefit from that?
Yeah, it's both, and it also depends on where you're at. In the book, I talk about the I call it the moonshot maturity model, and it starts at fix the basics, core excellence, growth, a big, hairy, audacious goal, and then a moonshot. But if you haven't got the basics right, and if you don't do what you do well, you know, you can have a moonshot or you can dream all you like, but if you can't do what you do now well, then, you know, probably save yourself the heartache.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, you know, and it again depends where you are. If you're struggling to pay the bills, if you're struggling to get the cash flow, if you're struggling to collect cash, if you're, you know, you have to survive, and that's so you do have to take a short-term focus, but you do have to have hope for the future. And yet, you know, so in that sense, you know, you might put 95% of your time on survival and 5% on the hope for what the future has. But then there will be other organisations, and this is why it's so fundamental, that the organisations that have the basics right can then put their attention to the growth and to big goals and longer term. And that's why having the commercial foundations are so important. If those foundations are set, it gives you more capacity to work on innovation and work on a long-term game, rather than just living day to day trying to survive.
Yeah, it seems like having both, like you said, is very important, short term and long term, and finding that balance between them. Um, yeah, other than that, Chris also asked, do you think that design thinking can really create breakthroughs, even today, when oftentimes it can feel like, especially when one is like brainstorming and, you know, the paper's still blank, you're like, maybe everything has been already done. And so I guess the question is kind of questioning design thinking. Can it really create breakthrough still? Is there a possibility out there?
It absolutely can. And what we need to do is to help people build it into their arsenal of tools. And design thinking does not have to be so formal. If we get to the point that we can educate people to do this on the fly, because some people don't have the luxury of time to hold a workshop, and they don't have the luxury of time to work on X amount of prototypes and put. There was I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, when we're walking the park, I'm slightly digressing from design thinking, but it was a massive UK health insurance company, and this lady works for them. We just saw each other in the park and just got into a chat. And they've got a long-term plan, which sort of also talks about what we're talking about before. But they've got a long-term plan, and they've got some of these applications that they were going to roll out over the next 2 years. It was going to take 2 years to get there. And now what's happened is they've done it in 6 weeks. They've done it, right? Because they ended up with with the need to do it and how to do it. So they need to want to and to be flexible enough to be able to adopt to it. But I guess my point is, some organisations need to move at speed, and as long as you get people to think in a design thinking framework, by empathizing, by can we test this? Can we have we defined the problem properly? And that just might be accelerated, and you don't have the time for the debate or the conversation, but it's a level of awareness. And I believe in stressful times that will help people make better decisions. And again, it gets back to that point. It's not about making perfect decisions. It's probably about making fast, better decisions. Right. And I think, and because they're thinking that way, it will open up to breakthroughs, because there'll be pennies that drop. There will be an awareness. There'll be one extra conversation that they will have because they're thinking design thinking. Yeah. That will then just send the mind off, and they'll get that breakthrough, because that's their starting reference point. They're not using a reference point that's stuck in a mindset. They're actually quickly working through the way to go through it.
Yeah, that was kind of my main takeaway from the book as well. Kind of decision making in times of disruption. Like, how can one company succeed in one time, but the other not, maybe even in very similar situations. And I just wanted to give you some time to really talk about, how do you see readers of the book using it, and what value do you hope that it will bring to them? As kind of like a final question to you.
Yeah. How will people use the book? That's the question, yeah?
Yeah, basically how you would like them to use the book, and how, what do you want them to know going into it?
Yeah. The first thing that I want people to know going into it is that the book is principles, and it's about and it's directional. It's a guide. It helps you, but it doesn't have the answers. It's not like you need to do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, and if you do those perfectly, you end up with the outcome that you desire. So, and the other point with the book is you could actually start anywhere that you like. And whilst I'm very firm, and I've spoken many times a lot about the fact that the commercial needs to be a foundation, you can start at create, you can start at change, depending on where you are in the organisation. So you don't have to. It's not a linear equation from that point of view, but it does have helpful hints or helpful steps that you can possibly take, and they're really thought provokers. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And then it's with it. And again, it's not telling the answer. It's just like, what do you think of this? but hopefully where it lands the audience is that they also get a positive energy that you know that yes, we do have disruption, and yes, some of it's pretty shitty. It's not nice, but how you approach it and your mindset, and for leaders, how you lead and how you talk to people, and how you engage people. And I just hope people get left with a great sense of positivity that, you know, if they want to achieve things, that, you know, they can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great ending message, I think. I really enjoyed the book, and I would encourage all our viewers to go out and get the book. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Fit for Disruption by Matthew Weber. Yeah, you can get it on Kindle. You can get the paperback, whichever you prefer. But as someone who necessarily isn't, you know, like I'm not a CEO of a company right now, but aspiring to, you know, one day work in that kind of position, I really found it really interesting. And I see it as not only training for maybe the future, but even right now in the organizations I work in, kind of giving me a lens to look at them in a new light.
And this might be a silly comment to make, Mickey, but it's not meant to be intellectual. It's actually meant to be quite easy to read. And true story, one of the greatest leaders that I ever worked for, his name is Guy Russo, and he used to be the president of McDonald's here in Australia, and then McDonald's in Greater China, but he ran the Australian version of Kmart. But when he spoke about strategy or anything we did in our business, everybody from the truck driver to the person on the cashier to the distribution centre workers to the financial accountants to the leadership group needed to be all on the same page and to be able to understand the language. So I was deliberate, and what I wanted to do was make sure that this book was something, I didn't want to over intellectualize it. I just wanted to make it simple and just flick through it. I mean, you'll probably find lots of intellectual errors in it, but it's not meant to be intellectual. It's meant to be simple, a guide, and just something helpful for everybody to help cope with disruption.
Yeah, that's exactly how it came across, and I really hope that you know, people read it and enjoy it the same way that it was intended. And
Thank you.
so that said, I kind of wanted to give you some time to shout out any of your socials that you would like people to follow, just to keep, you know, track of future work and ideas.
Yeah. Cool. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so that's Matthew C. Weber. I don't often get the full name unless my mother is telling me off, but it's Matthew C. Weber for LinkedIn. Instagram, it's Fit for Disruption, but the 4 is the number 4, so Fit number 4 Disruption. And on Twitter and Instagram, it's Fit for Disruption, the words.
Okay. I'm writing them down on the chat just so everyone kind of has it.
Yeah.
And for us, you can follow us on SVDT, Silicon Valley Design Thinking Club. And you can search for us on Twitter for Silicon Valley Design Thinking Club, and we should show up, as well as we have a very active group on LinkedIn that you can follow as well. Just search for Silicon Valley Design Thinking Club. You can search for Stanford with it if it's not showing up, and we should definitely show up. The links are going to be in the chat. And thank you so much for joining, everyone. And thank you so much, Matthew, for all that.
Thanks, everybody. That was great. Thank you.
When I faked in